They called her a bridge between two crowns, yet she was crushed beneath them both. In the smoke of early Tudor England, Margaret Tudor stood at the edge of history. Sister to one of its most infamous kings, wife to one of Scotland's proudest monarchs, and mother to a dynasty that would one day rule both thrones. But her name was written in margins, not in marble. She was sent north as a symbol of peace, only to find herself a prisoner of politics, a queen among strangers. Her heart followed love, her duty followed blood, and both betrayed her. Letters she wrote to her brother Henry VIII were left unanswered, her pleas sealed away in silence. In her final years, the woman who once united two kingdoms was left alone, her crown traded for a quiet exile. History remembers Henry, it remembers Mary, but between them was Margaret, the queen who vanished between two thrones. She was born into one of England's most powerful dynasties, a daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the union that ended the Wars of the Roses. In her veins ran the blood that rebuilt a fractured kingdom. Yet her destiny was not to rule England, but to be sent away from it. At 13, Margaret Tudor crossed the border to Scotland, her marriage to King James IV sealed with promises of eternal peace. The wedding was grand, the hope sincere, and for a moment, two kingdoms looked toward the same horizon. She became Queen of Scots, beloved for her grace, her youth, her royal lineage. But behind the smiles of the court, Scotland saw her as the English queen, a guest wearing a crown. When James IV fell at Flodden in 1513, Margaret's life changed overnight. A widow at 23, she was suddenly the mother of a king and the regent of a restless nation. The peace her father dreamed of shattered under the weight of old rivalries. Henry VIII, now King of England, watched her every move not as a brother, but as a ruler measuring a pawn. The sister of one king, the widow of another, Margaret Tudor, stood at the fragile intersection of love and power. But behind the titles and treaties, what truly remained of the woman beneath the crown? The story of Margaret Tudor began not in palaces, but in preparation. Born in 1489 at Westminster Palace, she was the eldest daughter of the first Tudor king, raised under the weight of royal diplomacy. Every word she learned, every smile she practiced, was part of a kingdom's strategy. Even as a child, she was taught that her future would not belong to her but to England's survival. When she was betrothed to James IV of Scotland, she was barely old enough to hold a quill steady. Yet in 1503, she crossed the cold, mist-covered border, riding toward Edinburgh as the young bride of a man twice her age. The marriage was designed to unite two warring nations. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace, they called it. But in truth, Margaret herself was the treaty. James IV, though rough and proud, treated her with affection at first. He admired her courage, her golden Tudor hair, the fire in her eyes that reminded him she came from kings. For a brief time, Scotland adored her, the English rose blooming in northern soil. She bore children, learned the rhythms of the Scottish court, and slowly began to wield quiet influence beside her husband. But the light that shone on her coronation day was not the warmth of love, it was the glare of expectation. To Scotland, she was a symbol of peace. To England, a guarantee of obedience. And to herself, perhaps, only a shadow waiting to fall. When the drums of war began to echo once again between the two kingdoms, Margaret's carefully built world trembled. Her husband would march to meet her brother's army, and with that, her life and her fate would change forever. The victory England celebrated at Flodden in 1513 was built on the silence that followed. James IV lay dead on the battlefield, and his 23-year-old widow sat in Edinburgh Castle, surrounded by soldiers who spoke her name with suspicion. Overnight, the young queen became the mother of a child king, James V, and the fragile regent of a country that trusted no one. Margaret tried to hold the crown steady. She signed decrees in trembling ink, walked through halls lined with men who swore loyalty but whispered in Scots that she was the English woman. She wrote to her brother Henry VIII, begging for aid not as a ruler, but as a sister desperate for peace. His replies came cold, political, measured in strategy rather than affection. To him, she was not family. She was leverage. The court began to fracture around her. Ambitious nobles circled, each one eager to pull the young king from her grasp. Even her moments of solace became scandal. Her affection for Archibald Douglas, a nobleman of charm and calculation, turned into gossip that consumed the court. "Love is my rebellion," she once wrote, perhaps half believing it. By marrying Douglas, she thought she could protect her son and secure her power. Instead, she sealed her own isolation. The alliance she hoped would shield her made her an outcast to both England and Scotland. Her letters grew longer, her handwriting heavier, her pleas unanswered. In portraits from those years, her eyes seemed distant, not proud, not broken, simply weary of being the peace everyone else demanded. The cost of being queen was not measured in jewels or gold, but in the silence that followed every choice she made. The marriage that was meant to save her became the very chain that bound her. Archibald Douglas, once her protector, soon revealed the hunger behind his charm. He took control of her estates, her letters, even her access to her son. The Scottish lords, already distrustful of their English-born queen, now saw her as a liability, a woman ruled by a man they despised. Her brother Henry VIII watched from across the border, calculating in silence. He sent no army, no envoy, only a letter laced with cold diplomacy. England must remain neutral. It said words that sounded less like neutrality and more like abandonment. As factions within the Scottish court fought for the young king's loyalty, Margaret was pushed further into exile. Her own child, James V, was taken from her care and raised under the watch of those who called her traitor. She fled to the borders, then to England, clutching a handful of letters she hoped might soften her brother's heart. None did. Years passed. The woman who once rode into Edinburgh as the bright symbol of peace was now a wanderer between two realms that both rejected her. Even love had turned to ash. Douglas betrayed her, siding with her enemies to secure his own survival. In a final act of defiance, she returned to Scotland, not as queen or regent, but as a mother determined to see her son again. She was not welcomed with ceremony, only with silence. The gates of the palace that once echoed her laughter closed behind her as if sealing a tomb of memory. The crown she had once worn now belonged to her son, and the only legacy she could offer him was the warning written in her eyes. That power is never shared, only borrowed, until history decides who may keep it. The years that followed were quiet, almost ghost-like. Margaret Tudor no longer appeared in court pageants or royal letters. The grand halls of Holyrood gave way to the cold stone of Methven Castle, a place that felt more like exile than refuge. She lived there with few attendants, surrounded by memories of crowns and betrayals, her name spoken less with reverence and more with regret. Her third marriage, to Henry VIII, seemed at first a chance at peace, but it quickly decayed under the same weight that had crushed her earlier unions: ambition, mistrust, and the unrelenting politics of blood. She wrote again to her brother, Henry VIII, this time not as a queen or a diplomat, but as a sister who wanted simply to go home. The letters went unanswered, or worse, intercepted. Her pleas became paper ghosts, lost in the corridors of power. By the time her health began to fade, Margaret was no longer seen as the bridge between kingdoms. She was a cautionary tale, a shadow of the Tudor name. When she died in 1541, there was no grand funeral, no royal procession. History recorded it briefly, as if it were a footnote, not the closing of a chapter that had bound two nations together. Yet in that quiet end lay a haunting dignity. The woman who once embodied the fragile peace between England and Scotland departed as she had lived between two worlds, misunderstood by both. Outside, the northern wind rattled the windows of Methven, carrying away the last echo of a queen history chose not to remember. Margaret Tudor's story did not end in the silence of Methven Castle. It lingered, hidden in the bloodlines of those who followed. Her grandson, James VI of Scotland, would become James I of England, the first monarch to unite both crowns under one rule. The dream her father once imagined and her marriage once promised was finally realized, but her name was missing from the victory. For centuries, she remained a footnote, overshadowed by her brother Henry VIII, his wives, and her niece, Mary, Queen of Scots. The history written by men favored kings who conquered, not women who endured. Yet behind every treaty and royal seal that led to union, there was Margaret's signature, faint but indelible. Modern historians have begun to trace her letters, her decisions, her rebellions. They reveal not a pawn, but a strategist, a woman who fought to survive in a world that never forgave her for doing so. The irony of her legacy is as sharp as the crown she once wore. Her life was defined by separation, but her lineage achieved the union that shaped Britain itself. In a way, Margaret Tudor never truly vanished. Her story was simply waiting to be remembered, a reminder that sometimes the greatest architects of history are those who stand unseen between the light of power and the shadow of loss. In the grand theater of Tudor history, Margaret Tudor stands where the spotlight fades between the blinding brilliance of her brother Henry and the tragic glow of her niece Mary. Yet her silence, her endurance, and her forgotten influence hold the truest mirror to what power really costs. She was born into light but died in shadow, and between those extremes lay the truth of her life. That peace is built not by kings, but by those who are forced to live between them. Her story is not one of defeat, but of survival, quiet, human, and defiant. The unity of England and Scotland, so often attributed to the crowns of men, was in fact written in the patience of a woman history refused to celebrate. And though her name faded from the marble of palaces, it endures in the blood of every monarch who followed. Because in the end, every crown casts a shadow, and Margaret Tudor was the shadow that made the light possible. History remembers the kings who conquered and the queens who burned, but not the woman who held two kingdoms together with nothing but her will. Margaret Tudor's story is a quiet echo, but one that still deserves to be heard. Which part of her journey stays with you most, the crown she wore, the love she lost, or the silence she endured? Share your thoughts below, and let her memory live where it was once erased.